It was a Tuesday morning in 2019 when a woman named Linda sat in the parking lot of a megachurch in Houston, Texas, crying into her steering wheel. She had just written another check, this one for $2,000. Money she didn't have, money she'd borrowed, money she absolutely needed for her daughter's medical bills. But the pastor had told her that this was her seed, that God was testing her faith, that if she just gave generously enough, the floodgates of heaven would open and pour blessings back into her life tenfold. Linda wasn't stupid. She had a master's degree. She'd worked in accounting for 12 years. But she was desperate, and someone had handed her a theology that told her desperation was temporary, that her breakthrough was just one more offering away. Linda's story isn't unique. Multiply it by tens of millions, and you start to understand the sheer scale of what we're talking about. This is the prosperity gospel. And for the better part of a century, it has been one of the most powerful and most controversial religious movements on planet Earth. It has built empires. It has made men billionaires while their congregations struggled to pay rent. It has exported itself from American soil to every corner of the world, particularly to Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, where it has taken root with extraordinary force. At its peak, it was virtually untouchable. Critics were dismissed as faithless, journalists were silenced, politicians looked the other way. But something is changing. The cracks that began as whispers are now roaring. The foundations that were once unshakable are visibly crumbling. And the question worth asking, the one that nobody in the movement wants you to think about, is not whether the prosperity gospel is in decline. It's whether it can survive at all. Welcome to Professor Archive. I'm glad you're here. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this right now, and what time is it? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely love knowing. We have viewers from Nairobi to Nashville, from Manila to Manchester, and every single location brings a different relationship with what we're about to discuss. Also, while you're down there, hit that subscribe button, and if this channel has ever taught you something new, something that made you see the world differently, consider leaving a super thanks. It genuinely keeps this kind of deep research possible. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because you cannot understand why the prosperity gospel is dying without understanding how it was born, and how breathtakingly audacious its origins actually were. The year is 1947. America has just come through the Second World War. The country is anxious, electrified, and searching for meaning. Into this moment steps a man named William Marion Branham, a faith healer from Kentucky who claimed that an angel had visited him and given him supernatural powers to heal the sick and read people's minds. Branham began drawing enormous crowds. Tens of thousands would flock to his tent revivals. And here's where it gets interesting. Branham was not preaching about money, not yet. He was preaching about miracles, but he created the infrastructure. He created the model, the traveling tent revival, the electrified crowd, the charismatic leader who communicated directly with God on behalf of the people. He planted the seed, if you'll pardon the metaphor. It was another man who took that seed and turned it into something grotesquely different. Oral Roberts, born in 1918 in a farmhouse in Oklahoma. He grew up desperately poor, the son of a Pentecostal preacher. At 17, he claimed to be miraculously healed of tuberculosis, and that healing became the cornerstone of his entire theology. By the early 1950s, Roberts had his own tent revival circuit, his own radio program, and eventually his own television ministry. Television. This is the key that unlocked everything. For the first time in human history, a preacher could speak directly into the living rooms of millions of people simultaneously. And Roberts understood this with terrifying clarity. But even Oral Roberts wasn't yet the full-blown prosperity preacher we'd recognize today. The theology was still forming, still evolving. The man who sharpened it into its most lethal form was a largely forgotten figure today, a preacher named Kenneth E. Hagin. And if you've never heard that name, that's somewhat remarkable because Hagin is arguably the most influential figure in modern charismatic Christianity that most people outside religious studies have never heard of. Hagin claimed that he had died multiple times and visited both heaven and hell. He claimed that Jesus appeared to him personally on at least 8 separate occasions to give him specific spiritual teachings. Most significantly, Hagin developed what he called the Word of Faith doctrine, the theological backbone of the prosperity gospel. The core idea is this: faith is a force. Words are containers of that force. If you speak the right words with enough faith, you can literally create reality. Health, wealth, success. These are not God's gifts distributed according to his mysterious will. They are your divine rights, available on demand if you know how to claim them. Poverty and sickness, by this logic, are signs of weak faith, which means the poor are poor because they don't believe hard enough. Take a moment and let that sink in. Hagin's influence on subsequent generations of preachers was immense. He established Rhema Bible Training College in Oklahoma in 1974, and from that institution flowed a river of future prosperity preachers who would go on to build the movement into a global phenomenon. Among them, Kenneth Copeland, one name you absolutely know, a man whose journey from struggling actor and folk singer to private jet-owning televangelist is one of the most extraordinary stories in American religious history. Copeland began as Oral Roberts' personal pilot. Let that detail sit with you. He flew Roberts around, absorbed his teachings, and then launched his own ministry with his wife Gloria in 1967 from a small house in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with $70 in their pocket. Today, Kenneth Copeland Ministries sits on a $760 million tax-exempt estate that includes an airport, multiple mansions, and, famously, a private jet fleet that Copeland has defended publicly by saying he can't fly commercial because he'd be in a long tube with a bunch of demons. That quote is real. He said that on television, and it became one of the most watched clips in the slow-motion collapse we're going to talk about. But before we get to the collapse, we have to appreciate just how powerful this machine became. Because the prosperity gospel didn't just succeed, it dominated. By the 1980s, the movement had an entire economy. You had television networks, Trinity Broadcasting Network, founded by Paul and Jan Crouch in 1973, eventually becoming the largest religious broadcasting network in the world, available in 75 countries, broadcasting to an estimated 2 billion people daily. 2 billion? You had publishing empires, you had music industries, you had Bible colleges, conferences, merchandise, and a feedback loop of celebrity preachers who endorsed each other, appeared on each other's shows, and collectively reinforced the message. God wants you to be rich, and your financial donations to this ministry are your vehicle for getting there. The theology is clever, by the way. It's important to acknowledge that. It didn't become this powerful because it was stupid. The prosperity gospel worked because it gave suffering people something incredibly seductive, a framework in which they had agency over their circumstances. You are not a passive victim of poverty. You are an active agent of your own breakthrough. Give, plant a seed, speak it into existence, and watch God move. For someone drowning in hopelessness, that is an intoxicating idea. And it was particularly effective in communities that had experienced systemic marginalization. African American churches, immigrant communities, working-class congregations, people who had every reason to feel powerless were handed a theology that told them they were anything but. The prosperity gospel spread through Black Pentecostalism in ways that are deeply complicated and deeply important. Preachers like Frederick Price, Creflo Dollar, and Eddie Long built massive congregations in Black communities, and the theology filled a genuine spiritual and emotional need, even as it often caused economic harm. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the prosperity gospel had a new superstar, Joel Osteen. The son of John Osteen, a Houston pastor who had built Lakewood Church from a modest congregation into a substantial ministry. When John died in 1999, his son Joel, who had never attended seminary, who had no formal theological training, who had been working primarily in television production for the church, stepped up to deliver the sermon. And something extraordinary happened. Joel Osteen was magnetic. The congregation responded to him in a way that astonished everyone, including Joel himself. Lakewood Church moved into the Compaq Center, the former home of the Houston Rockets NBA franchise, in 2005. It is now the largest church in the United States, with an average weekly attendance of approximately 52,000 people. Joel Osteen's books have sold over 50 million copies worldwide. His net worth is estimated at $100 million. And critically, Osteen's version of the prosperity gospel is smoother, softer, more palatable than what came before. He doesn't wear rhinestone suits. He doesn't wave his handkerchief at people and make them fall down. He's clean-cut, relentlessly positive, and speaks in the language of self-help and personal empowerment, as much as traditional theology. He brought the prosperity gospel to people who would never have sat through a Benny Hinn crusade. Which brings us to Benny Hinn. If Joel Osteen is the prosperity gospel's polished retail face, Benny Hinn has always been its theatrical head. Born in Israel to a Greek father and Armenian mother, Hinn emigrated to Canada as a teenager and claims to have had a born-again experience in 1972. He began conducting what he called healing crusades, in which people were allegedly healed of cancer, blindness, deafness, and other serious conditions. His signature move, slaying people in the spirit by touching or even pointing at them, sending them falling backward, became one of the most imitated and most mocked performances in modern Christianity. Here's a fact that is not widely known. A 1993 investigative report by the NBC News magazine Dateline sent cameras to follow up with people who claimed to have been healed at Benny Hinn's crusades. Of the people they managed to track down, not a single one could provide medical documentation of their healing. Several had stopped taking prescribed medications for serious conditions based on their belief they had been healed, with genuinely dangerous consequences. Hinn's response to this kind of scrutiny has consistently been to claim persecution, to invoke spiritual warfare, and to keep going. The crusades continued, the donations continued, the private jets and luxury hotels continued. And for a long time, the accountability did not. But accountability has a way of finding its moment. And the prosperity gospel's moment of reckoning came from multiple directions simultaneously, which is why what we're experiencing now isn't just a minor correction, it's a structural unraveling. The first major blow came from the United States Senate. In November 2007, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, then the ranking Republican member of the Senate Finance Committee, launched a formal investigation into 6 major prosperity gospel ministries. The 6 ministries were Benny Hinn Ministries, Joyce Meyer Ministries, Creflo Dollar Ministries, Eddie Long's New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, Kenneth Copeland Ministries, and Paula White Ministries. Together, these organizations controlled hundreds of millions, possibly billions, of dollars in assets, all of it tax-exempt. Grassley wanted to know whether these ministries were complying with IRS regulations that required nonprofit religious organizations to operate for the benefit of the public rather than private individuals. He sent letters requesting financial documents, compensation records, and accounting information. You know what happened? Almost all of them refused to cooperate. Not all of them, but most. Kenneth Copeland Ministries, in particular, issued a statement essentially arguing that the Senate had no authority to investigate a religious organization's finances, a position that many legal scholars disputed. The investigation ultimately ended without formal charges, partly because the Senate Finance Committee lacked enforcement authority, and partly because of genuine legal complexities around religious freedom protections under the First Amendment. But the investigation did something more important than any legal consequence could have achieved. It put these organizations' finances on the front page of newspapers across America. It forced conversations that had previously been confined to theological journals and small Christian watchdog websites into the mainstream. People started asking questions they hadn't asked before. Where exactly does this money go? That question gained new urgency in 2015 when a remarkable documentary aired on HBO. The Spellcaster was not the title. What I'm thinking of is John Oliver's Last Week Tonight segment, which was technically television comedy, not a documentary, but its impact was documentary grade. Oliver dedicated a 20-minute segment to the prosperity gospel, explaining exactly how the seed faith donation model worked, demonstrating the tax exemptions that churches receive, and, in a comedic masterstroke, announcing that he had founded his own church, Our Lady of Perpetual Exemption, to demonstrate just how easy it was to do exactly what these ministries were doing legally. The segment was watched over 9 million times on YouTube. It won a Peabody Award, and it introduced the mechanics of prosperity gospel fundraising to an audience that had never set foot in a megachurch. Then came the documentaries. Netflix's The Righteous Gemstones was fictional, but the real ones landed harder. American Gospel, Christ Alone, produced by Brandon Kimber and released in 2018, was a theological critique of the prosperity gospel that went viral among evangelical Christians themselves. That's the part that matters. This wasn't secular critics attacking religion from the outside. This was Christians, serious, devout, Bible-believing Christians, making the case that the prosperity gospel was not just financially corrupt, but theologically heretical. The documentary featured respected evangelical theologians arguing, with chapter and verse, that the Word of Faith movement had fundamentally distorted the New Testament message. It was watched by millions, shared in small group Bible studies, and sparked intense debate within evangelical churches across America. The internet changed everything about accountability. And this is where we have to spend some time, because it's genuinely one of the most fascinating dimensions of the prosperity gospel's decline. Before social media, a pastor's reputation was essentially local. If Kenneth Copeland said something bizarre at a conference in Dallas, the only people who knew about it were the people in that room, most of whom were already his devoted followers and would interpret it charitably. Now every sermon is recorded, every offhand comment, every private jet prayer request, every lavish birthday party posted to Instagram. All of it is instantly available to the entire world, including people who are not predisposed to interpret it charitably. The Kenneth Copeland "Demons on the Airplane" clip we mentioned earlier, that went viral globally. But perhaps even more damaging was a 2019 interview Copeland gave to journalist Lisa Guerrero for Inside Edition. Guerrero asked Copeland directly and on camera why he needed private jets, specifically why he needed a $36 million Gulfstream Vi when the ministry already owned other aircraft. Copeland's response, increasingly agitated, was that you couldn't have enough of them, and that flying commercial would expose him to the enemy. The visual of a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars operating a tax-exempt ministry, angrily defending his private jet collection, was circulated endlessly. It became a meme, and memes in the current cultural environment are more powerful than op-eds. Creflo Dollar had a similar moment in 2015 when his ministry launched a campaign asking supporters to donate toward the purchase of a $65 million Gulfstream G650 private jet, described as a necessary tool to fulfill God's mission, for a man who was already a multimillionaire with a previous private jet. The backlash was so swift and so ferocious that the campaign was taken down within 48 hours, though not before it had been screenshot, archived, and shared across every platform imaginable. Dollar eventually got his jet, reports suggest through private channels, but the PR damage was done. But here is what I think is the deepest and most consequential factor in the prosperity gospel's decline, and it's one that doesn't get discussed enough. It's the data on generational religious disaffiliation. Americans, particularly young Americans, are leaving organized religion at a historically unprecedented rate. The Pew Research Center has been tracking this for decades, and the numbers are stark. In 2007, 78% of Americans identified as Christian. By 2023, that number had dropped to 63%. The category that has grown most dramatically is the knowns, people who identify as religiously unaffiliated. In 2007, knowns comprised about 16% of the population. By 2023, they were at 28%, and among adults under 30, the percentage is even higher. Approximately 34% of young Americans now identify as religiously unaffiliated. This is called religious disaffiliation, and it is a catastrophe for the prosperity gospel in particular, for a specific reason. The prosperity gospel has always relied on a very particular kind of believer, someone who is both desperate enough to respond to the message and trusting enough of institutional religious authority to give consistently over time. Young people raised with internet access and equipped with a healthy skepticism of institutional authority are exactly the demographic least likely to sustain that kind of belief. They've grown up watching the Kenneth Copeland clips. They've seen the documentaries. They have questions that prosperity preachers have historically answered with spiritual pressure. That's doubt. That's the enemy. Plant another seed. And those tactics simply don't work on a generation trained to Google everything. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated this process in ways that are still being fully understood. The prosperity gospel made a specific, falsifiable claim. If you have enough faith, God will protect you and prosper you. The pandemic was, among other things, a large-scale test of that claim, and the results were complicated to say the least. In March 2020, as the pandemic began shutting down America, Kenneth Copeland held a televised service in which he pointed at the camera and declared COVID-19 over. "I blow the wind of God on you," he said to the camera. "You are destroyed forever." COVID-19, as we know, was not destroyed forever. More darkly, several prominent prosperity gospel preachers contracted the virus themselves. Most survived, but the spectacle, men and women who had claimed divine health protection getting sick like everyone else, was not lost on their congregations. Some preachers compounded the problem by initially discouraging their congregations from following public health guidelines, framing masks and vaccines as evidence of lack of faith. When some of those congregation members became seriously ill, the theological implications were hard to escape. If you got COVID, were you simply not faithful enough? And if faith couldn't protect you from a respiratory virus, what exactly could it do? The death that landed hardest in terms of the movement's credibility was that of Marcus Lamb. Lamb was the founder of Daystar Television Network, one of the major broadcasting platforms for prosperity gospel content. Lamb had been a vocal opponent of COVID vaccines, encouraging his viewers to trust God over medicine. He died of COVID-19 complications in November 2021. He was 64. The tragedy of his death aside, its symbolism was impossible to ignore. Now we have to talk about the scandal dimension because no accounting of the prosperity gospel's decline would be complete without it. And this is where the story gets genuinely dark. Eddie Long. The late bishop of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia, one of the largest megachurches in America, with 25,000 members at its peak. Long was a flamboyant, physically imposing figure who preached a theology of wealth and masculine authority, and was known for a strongly anti-gay stance, often preaching against homosexuality from the pulpit. In 2010, 4 young men, all former members of New Birth's youth ministry, filed lawsuits alleging that Long had used his spiritual authority, along with financial gifts, trips, and other material benefits, to coerce them into sexual relationships. Long denied the allegations. The cases were eventually settled out of court for undisclosed amounts. Long died of cancer in 2017, and the terms of the settlements meant full accountability never came. But his story was a microcosm of a pattern that would repeat across the prosperity gospel world. The intersection of unchecked spiritual authority, financial opacity, and sexual misconduct. Zachary Timms. The founder of New Destiny Christian Center in Orlando, one of the fastest-growing churches in Florida, was found dead in a New York hotel room in 2011 with a bag of white powder near his body. He was 42. Todd Bentley. A Canadian healing evangelist who led what was called the Lakeland Revival in 2008, a months-long series of services in Florida that drew hundreds of thousands of people from around the world and was celebrated across the charismatic world as a genuine move of God. Bentley claimed miraculous healings were happening nightly. He was commissioned and publicly endorsed by a group of the most senior apostolic leaders in the charismatic world in a ceremony broadcast live. Weeks later, it emerged that Bentley had been having an affair with a woman on his ministry staff. He and his wife divorced, he married the other woman, and the revival, and so recently proclaimed as divine intervention, quietly collapsed. What made the story particularly striking was that several of the leaders who had publicly commissioned Bentley admitted afterward that they had been aware of concerns about his character, but had gone ahead with the commissioning ceremony anyway. These scandals are not coincidental. They flow from a structural problem within the prosperity gospel's model of ministry. When you build a theology around the idea that God's blessing is evidenced by material wealth, and when that theology concentrates financial resources and spiritual authority in the hands of a single charismatic individual with minimal external accountability, you create conditions that are essentially ideal for abuse. The pastor's desire for wealth is reframed as God's will. The pastor's demands, financial, emotional, sometimes sexual, are framed as divine requirements. Questioning the pastor is spiritually dangerous. Leaving is framed as abandoning God. This is, by any clinical definition, a cult dynamic. And when the people inside it start to see it for what it is, which is happening with increasing frequency, the exit rate accelerates. The rise of the Deconstruction movement within American Christianity is intimately connected to the decline of the prosperity gospel. Deconstruction in this context refers to the process by which people raised in high-control religious environments systematically examine and often abandon the beliefs they were raised with. This movement has its own podcasts, its own community spaces, its own vocabulary, and it has produced an enormous wave of former prosperity gospel believers who are not merely leaving their churches. They are publicly documenting exactly why, in detail, on social media platforms with audiences of hundreds of thousands. Figures like Tia Levings, who wrote about her experience in a Word of Faith community in her memoir, A Well-Trained Wife. Or the numerous former megachurch members who have turned their stories into YouTube channels that collectively have millions of subscribers. The term church hurt has entered mainstream discourse. There are support groups. There is therapeutic literature. There is an entire infrastructure of deconstruction that did not exist 20 years ago, and that functions as an extremely effective counter-narrative to the prosperity gospel's messaging. What's particularly striking about the deconstruction community is how theologically sophisticated many of its members are. These are not people who left because they found religion boring or inconvenient. Many of them are deeply, earnestly spiritual. They left because they read their Bibles carefully, at the same Bibles their prosperity gospel preachers gave them, and found that what they were being taught did not match what was written there. The Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit. James 5:1-6. A searing condemnation of the rich who pile up wealth while their workers suffer. 1 Timothy 6:10, which doesn't say money is the root of all evil, but actually says the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. The prosperity gospel has always had a complicated relationship with these texts, and increasingly it's being called on it. And then there are the legal pressures. The IRS and various state attorneys general have been increasing their scrutiny of religious organizations in recent years. The religious exemptions that American law grants to churches are extraordinarily generous. Churches are not required to file the same financial disclosure forms that other nonprofits must file, and there is a deeply rooted constitutional reluctance to audit religious organizations' activities. But the exemptions are not unlimited. In 2023, the IRS was reportedly conducting dozens of investigations into religious organizations suspected of financial impropriety. Several state-level investigations have targeted specific ministries for consumer fraud, financial exploitation of vulnerable people, and money laundering. We are, it seems, approaching a legal inflection point. The global picture complicates the narrative in ways that are important to acknowledge. The prosperity gospel may be declining in its country of origin, but it is absolutely exploding in sub-Saharan Africa, in Brazil, in South Korea, and across Southeast Asia. Nigeria has become, by many measures, the global epicenter of prosperity gospel ministry. Pastors like David Oyedepo, founder of Living Faith Church, known as Winners Chapel, with a congregation estimated at 50,000 in his flagship Lagos location alone, and Chris Oyakhilome have built ministries of extraordinary scale. The Dunamis International Gospel Center in Abuja can accommodate 100,000 worshipers simultaneously. 100,000. In Ghana, in Kenya, in Uganda, the prosperity gospel has taken on specific local characteristics that differ meaningfully from its American origins. But the financial model is recognizably the same, and the harm is recognizably the same. Reports from across Africa document believers giving beyond their means, abandoning medical treatment in favor of faith healing, and finding themselves trapped in cycles of poverty that the theology promises to break but consistently fails to. There are African theologians, African Christian scholars who are increasingly vocally critical of these movements, and their voices are important precisely because they cannot be dismissed as Western cultural imperialism or secular anti-religious bias. When Ugandan theologian Emmanuel Katongole writes about the prosperity gospel's failure to address structural poverty, or when scholars at the Akrofi Kristaller Institute in Ghana document the movement's harmful economic effects on communities, that is a form of accountability from within the global body of Christianity that the movement struggles to deflect. We should also examine what's happening within mainstream evangelical Christianity more broadly, because the internal religious critique of the prosperity gospel has become more sophisticated and more widespread than at any previous point. Figures like John Piper, Tim Keller, who passed away in 2023 and was perhaps the most respected evangelical theologian of his generation, and David Platt have written and spoken extensively against the prosperity gospel, reaching audiences of millions of theologically conservative Christians who take their critiques seriously precisely because they come from people within the tradition. David Platt's book, Radical, published in 2010, sold more than 1 million copies and was a direct challenge to the prosperity gospel ethos. Platt is the pastor of McLean Bible Church in the Washington, D.C. area, and his argument, supported with extensive biblical scholarship, is that American Christianity has confused the American dream with the gospel of Jesus Christ. That book landing where it did, at the moment it did, among the demographic it reached, was genuinely significant. It wasn't popular with prosperity gospel teachers, but it was popular with their congregations. What does the data actually show about the prosperity gospel's trajectory right now? Attendance numbers at several prominent prosperity gospel megachurches have declined noticeably in recent years. Lakewood Church, though still enormous, has seen its numbers soften from their peak. Creflo Dollar's World Changers Church International in College Park, Georgia, has had fluctuating attendance figures. More tellingly, the donation revenues of several major television ministries have declined as their core demographic, older, loyal, long-term givers, ages and is not being replaced at the same rate by younger donors. Trinity Broadcasting Network, the broadcasting behemoth that carried prosperity gospel content to billions, has had an extraordinary run of internal turbulence. After the deaths of its founders, Paul and Jan Crouch, the network became embroiled in family infighting and financial controversies. Jan Crouch died in 2016. Paul had died in 2013. Their granddaughter, Brittany Coper, who had worked in the organization's finance department, went public with allegations of massive financial impropriety, allegations that were investigated and that resulted in the organization paying back approximately $1 million. The network continues to operate, but the institutional stability that characterized its first 4 decades is visibly fraying. Joyce Meyer is an interesting case study in how some prosperity-adjacent preachers have adapted under pressure. Meyer, who built a ministry empire from St. Louis, was one of the 6 ministries investigated by Senator Grassley. Unlike several of her peers, Meyer has over the years moderated her rhetoric around wealth, increased financial transparency in her organization, and pivoted her public messaging more toward practical Christian living and social justice. Her ministry's humanitarian arm, Hand of Hope, does substantial and documented charitable work. Meyer's adaptation suggests that some figures within the movement understand the pressure they're under and are making strategic adjustments. Others have simply doubled down, and this paradoxically might be accelerating the decline. Kenneth Copeland, now in his late 80s, shows no signs of moderating his claims or his lifestyle. His ministry's most viral moments are increasingly characterized by something approaching open mockery from the outside world. His wind-blowing declarations, his demon-on-plane comments, his angry confrontations with journalists. Within his core community, this is interpreted as persecution. Outside it, it functions as comedic content that introduces new audiences to the absurdity of what he represents. Every viral clip of Copeland being bizarre wins him no new followers. It only further educates the uninitiated about what the prosperity gospel looks like at its most unfiltered. There's a psychological concept worth introducing here, called the backfire effect. Research has shown that sometimes, when people's deeply held beliefs are challenged, they don't change their minds. They dig in harder. The prosperity gospel has a significant population of true believers who will double down in the face of any and all evidence. They have been theologically prepared for skepticism. They have been told that doubt is the enemy, that persecution means you're doing God's work, that the world will always hate what God loves. These inoculations against doubt are extraordinarily effective on certain personalities. The question is whether they're effective enough on enough people to sustain the movement. The answer, based on the evidence we've examined, appears to be no, not anymore. And here is perhaps the most striking detail of all, saved deliberately for near the end, because it tells you something essential about where we actually are. Multiple prominent prosperity gospel preachers have, in recent years, either quietly or publicly distanced themselves from core elements of the doctrine. This is almost without historical precedent. The prosperity gospel has historically operated with remarkable theological consistency. The same ideas, the same fundraising techniques, the same promises, passed down from Hagin to his students, from Roberts to his successors. Now, those ideas are being reconsidered by people who built their ministries on them. Pastor Paula White, who was one of the 6 ministries investigated by the Grassley Senate inquiry, and who served as a spiritual advisor to Donald Trump, has in recent years moved her ministerial focus away from classic word of faith content and more toward political and prophetic themes. Whether this represents genuine theological evolution or simply strategic repositioning is difficult to say. But the repositioning itself is telling. What makes a theology die? Not the critiques of outsiders alone. Christianity has survived centuries of external criticism. What kills a theology is when it fails to deliver on its core promises often enough, for enough people that the community built around those promises loses critical mass. The prosperity gospel's core promise is concrete and falsifiable in a way that most religious claims are not. Eternal salvation cannot be verified in this lifetime. The resurrection cannot be photographed. But material wealth? That's auditable. And generation after generation of working-class believers who planted their seeds and never saw their harvest are starting, in enormous numbers, to say so. Loudly. Publicly, in ways that the internet ensures can never be unseen. Linda, the woman we met in that parking lot in Houston, she eventually left her church. It took her 3 more years and another $15,000 she didn't have. She found a small Episcopal congregation in her neighborhood. She describes the experience of sitting in a service where no one asked her for money as feeling, for the first time in years, like she could breathe. She is not alone. There are millions of Lindas. And they are finding each other online, in support groups, in deconstruction communities, in quiet conversations after services at churches that don't have private jets. The prosperity gospel has not disappeared. It may not disappear in our lifetimes. Religious movements, even discredited ones, have extraordinary staying power. But the combination of forces arrayed against it right now, generational disaffiliation, technological transparency, pandemic-era falsifiability, legal scrutiny, internal theological revolt, and the growing global chorus of voices who have first-hand experience of its harm, is unlike anything the movement has faced before. Its golden era is over. The question now is not whether it will decline, but how quickly and what will replace it. What might replace it is fascinating in its own right, but that might be a story for another episode. What I'd leave you with is this. Religious movements that survive are the ones that can adapt, that can hear the cries of the people they claim to serve, that can look in the mirror and reckon honestly with the distance between their promises and their behavior. History is full of movements that couldn't do that. They didn't necessarily vanish overnight. They faded. They became footnotes. They became cautionary tales taught in seminaries to students who would build better things in their wake. The prosperity gospel may be many things, but increasingly it is looking like a cautionary tale in real time.